Hey everyone, welcome back to the Grace and Truth Podcast. My name's Taylor Bacon. I'm the Associate Pastor at Grace Resurrection Methodist Church.
And I'm James Williams, Senior Pastor.
And in this week's episode, we are going to talk about something that makes almost everyone uncomfortable: money. Not in a stewardship campaign way, not a pledge drive, but we're going to sit with the actual, sometimes alarming things that Jesus said about wealth and ask what they mean for people like us, people with mortgages, 401ks, and all of that. So let's dive into this week's conversation. So, James, let's start with honesty.
Yeah.
When you hear the church talking about money, what's your gut reaction? Maybe not. I mean, I guess that's kind of a hard question because you've been on the speaking side of that for 30 some odd years.
Yeah.
But I mean, what do most people assume is coming when the church wants to talk about money?
Well, stewardship month that I used to do, I don't really do that as much anymore. I try to talk about stewardship throughout the year, which I found works.
Which I'm in favor
better.
of. Yeah, I like that.
I think it's necessary, and I think that money can define sometimes your relationship with God in some ways. I think that we can go overboard in the way we talk about needing money. And I also think that money and how we give is an indicator of how close we are in our relationship with Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some people probably get nervous when you say things like that, but it is true. It is true. And Jesus did have a treasure. We talked about Judas in our last podcast, and he had a treasure. So he understood the need for stewardship and the need for money. So it's not a bad thing, but it can really be a barrier too if you're not careful, I think, with getting people into the kingdom.
Yeah, and I think I've heard recently that 25% of Jesus's parables or teachings was about money.
Yeah.
Like a quarter of what he said was about money.
Well,
so obviously he cared about it. Obviously he had an opinion about it.
Well, there's more about money than there is about love in Scripture, actually. And I think it's because God knew that we would really struggle in that area.
Yeah. And so I think the real, I think what most people, if the church starts to talk about stewardship or a building campaign, obviously they're thinking, okay, they're just after my wallet. And I think some higher wealth individuals can be a little leery of the church because of that. They can say, well, I'm going to start going to this church. They're going to find out I have money and they're just going to want me for my wallet, right? What would you say to those people?
Well, I would say that sometimes that's been true. I think, to be fair, I think preachers sometimes have been in the mode of trying to meet budgets by getting folks that can support budgets into their churches. There's an old book, I don't know if you've ever read, I don't think you've ever read it because we talked about it, called Elmer Gantry by Sinclair Lewis. And Elmer Gantry, it was written in 1927, and it's about a preacher who is hard on his luck and needs money. And he gets this idea. He sees this revival preacher, and he goes to the revival meeting, and he sees them take up an offering, and people just fill these buckets with money at the revival meeting, at this tent meeting. And he gets an idea. He says, hey, I can do that. So he puts up his own tent, and he's such a great preacher, the town wants him to be their pastor. And they build a church, and he preaches, and he's not called, and he knows why he's doing it. And it's about his life and all the trouble he gets into because he was not called to be a pastor, and he was doing some things that he shouldn't be doing. And one of the things he says is that as he began to read, to try to learn to be a pastor, to keep this disguise up that he had started, that really turned into more than he thought it would. He said, I've learned to read Greek. I've learned to read Hebrew. I've learned the scriptures backwards and forwards. I've learned that blessed are the poor, but I've also learned that deacons are best when they are bank presidents. And, that is true, unfortunately, for some pastors, that they are so wrapped up in meeting their budget and making sure that money comes into the church that they compromise with people who are wealthy. And I think that that's not a good thing, but it's a real easy thing when you're in a situation where you have to raise your money to meet the budget in a ministry. So it's hard. It's hard. And I've always tried to really be careful about that stuff. And I don't make decisions about money. I don't make decisions that are against people in the church because of what they don't give. And I don't make decisions in the church for people based on what they do give. And I think as long as you can pastor in that way and not compromise that, you'll be okay. But as soon as you start to let money drive your leadership and decisions, and it's really easy to do, I think that God kind of takes his hands off some things and says, okay, have at it. And I've seen things really fall apart for some colleagues of mine who have compromised in that way.
Yeah, so it sounds like Jesus isn't anti-wealth or anti-money.
No,
He's
not
just
at all.
anti-attachment. Like,
Yeah.
he just doesn't, it's kind of where your treasure is. It's not kind of, it's where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. That's
Yes.
what I hear you saying, at least. Is
That's exactly what I'm
that's the
saying.
heart of Jesus' message, is that how attached are you to the wealth? How much does it drive you? How much does it lead your decision-making? And so, but with that, again, 25% of what Jesus taught was about money. But I think most of us, if we're being really honest, kind of soften it because we don't want to actually learn or embody what Jesus is saying. So like, again, the rich young ruler walks away sad and we just kind of, okay, well, that's his prerogative, right? Or the camel in the eye of the needle just kind of gets explained away. Like, what do you think's actually going on there? Like, what's really, I guess we just said what's at the heart of Jesus' teaching, but why are we so quick to brush that one off?
Because I think what Jesus really thought was that the love of money is the root of evil. It's not money itself. Money itself brings a lot of good things into our lives, into other people's lives. And it is necessary in the world in which we find ourselves. But the rich young ruler, it was less about money and more about what are you willing to give up for the kingdom? Because he came to Jesus because he knew that he was missing something. And I think just the fact that he came to Jesus and asked him these questions said a lot. And I always kind of feel sorry for the rich young ruler. It says he walked away sad. And so I always think, all right, what did he do after that? I wonder if he ever did end up coming back and really following Jesus. Because he started that conversation. He said, what do I need to do? Jesus said, this is what you need to do. And he said, oh, I can't do that. That's too much. And so I think as pastors and church leaders, we also are in that mode at times. But we tend to kind of make people comfortable with their decision not to give or not to fully be good stewards.
Okay, say more to that. I mean, we're okay when people pass up on this teaching. Is that what you're saying?
I think we are a lot easier on people than Jesus was, which I think is very interesting. Because when he walked away, Jesus could have said, "Oh, wait. Let's talk about this a little bit more."
Yeah,
and he didn't.
What I meant was,
yeah,
right.
Yeah, and he let him go. And I think we tend to make people feel more comfortable in not being good stewards and not giving, because one, it seems self-serving as a pastor, because part of your budget that you need to raise includes your compensation package.
Sure, yeah.
And then secondly, we don't want them to leave our church, so we don't want them to be uncomfortable. And I think that that's probably just as bad as the other side of it. I think there's a balance to it where we say to people, we're humans. In Western civilization, we really love comfort. And so we understand that we all live pretty good lives and money is a part of that. But when do you start to sacrifice for your faith? And a good test of that is tithing. Now, you have folks that are going to say, well, that's an Old Testament thing. You're going to have folks that say, well, you got to do that. You have to do it. But I think tithing is the best way to learn to be a good steward and a giver in kingdom work. Because if you think about it, I probably blow 10% of what I make on coffee every year. If you really think about it, I mean, I buy lots of coffee. I go out to eat a lot. I buy things for my home that I really don't need. I drive cars that are fairly new. So when I think, gosh, 10%, that's not a big ask, really, in many ways.
I mean, you're probably putting more into your retirement account.
Well, yeah,
right,
yeah, for sure, and so
more is going towards your mortgage. I mean, like it'd be
absolutely.
one of your lowest.
Well, someone was
commitments.
telling me last week actually that in 1970 to mid 1980s, people spent 28 to 35% of their salary on their mortgage payments. Now it's about 50%.
That's crazy.
It's crazy. I mean, a lot of people spend 50%.
Because that 28 to 30 is recommended. That's where you should fall today.
Yeah.
That's where you should fall today. That's
Yeah,
crazy.
it is. And I mean, a lot of people, I mean, really, a large percentage of people spend 50% of their salary on their mortgage payments. And so I think when you look at it from that perspective and you look at what could be done for Christ with just 10% of what you make, it's a hard thing for me to say no to. And so as a pastor, I feel like I have to be honest, but I also need to understand too. And I've done this better as I've gotten older. When I was younger, I was more dogmatic about it. But I also know that the people that are sitting there listening to me sometimes have some financial issues that happen to them that they can't help, that I don't know about. And that I shouldn't assume what people can give. And I shouldn't assume what people's financial situation is. Even if they live in a nice home and drive a nice car, I try not to assume what their financial picture is. You know, I don't judge people.
Yeah.
When I was younger, I probably judged a little bit harsher when I was a young preacher. But now I know that life is tough. Life is tough. And sometimes things are going on in our lives that people don't know about. And so I just try to assume that people are doing the best they can do to tithe or to give. And it really does sometimes cause a barrier between me and parishioners, though. I've seen that happen over the years after I've done a stewardship month, because people get offended and say, you know, I didn't come to church to hear about money. And so I don't want that to be the case, but I'll never stop talking about it because that's part of what we do.
Yeah. So you've made a good case for it being an important part of the life of the church, it being an important part of following Jesus.
Yeah.
It was definitely an important part of Jesus's teachings and ministry, but you can't talk about the idea of money in the church without addressing, you swing the pendulum the other way, the prosperity gospel.
Yeah.
So you never want someone to take what you just said and said, okay, well, if it's so important, then that has to mean that if I give, God's going to really give that back to me. If you don't know, the idea of the prosperity gospel is that, and I don't really know a lot of the history of it, maybe you know a little bit better than I do, but the idea is that whatever you put into the plate, you will get back tenfold in terms and in monetary value. I mean,
is what people teach.
They'll teach that it will come back monetarily.
Yes.
So what, I guess, let's go there, right?
Okay.
So where would you place caution in that? What's the line? Because that can be, I think, a bit of a fine line. It's easy to cross it or to use it, like you said, or to use it as a literal selling point.
Well, here's why it's so hard to deal with the prosperity gospel, because there's so much truth in the prosperity gospel. There is truth. There are clearly places throughout Scripture that promise, if you give and if you're faithful in giving generously, that you will receive it back in some form or the other. And there's one scripture in the New Testament that the prosperity preachers really love to use, that, you know, if you give this, it'll come back to you, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. I think that's spiritual blessings more than money blessings. But
that's what you said. You just said, which I think is the heart of it, is it'll come back to you in some transform.
That's right.
Not always monetarily.
That's right.
I would say hardly monetarily if you have lived experience with this.
And I know a good bit about this because I grew up just down the street from PTL, Jim and Tammy Baker, and their ministry in Charlotte, North Carolina. I worked there. I was a lifeguard at the water park there, and I knew their daughter really well. And I do know that it got him in a lot of trouble. He wrote a book called I Was Wrong several years ago because he ended up going to prison. Well, his sentence was 43 years, but he only ended up spending 5 years in prison for FCC violations and raising money over the air and that kind of thing. And when he got out of jail, a lot of people don't know this, but Billy and Ruth Graham actually gave him a place to live because his wife Tammy left him while he was in prison, married somebody else. And when he got out of jail, he didn't have anywhere to go. So Billy and Ruth Graham had a house in Hendersonville, North Carolina. They let him live there until he got back on his feet. Now he's in Branson. He has a TV show. And I've actually been on that show before.
Wow.
Because I kept in touch with him over the years. But he and I have very different theology, just really different. But Jim Baker, he was kind of the guy that started pushing the prosperity gospel in the 80s. And he preached. Now he says he was wrong. While he was in prison, he did a study on prosperity and money. And he says, I was wrong about that. Now his big thing is the end of time.
Yeah.
You know, he's
something that sells almost as easily.
Yeah, he's a big Revelation guy. And so he sells freeze-dried food and all that stuff now. And if you ever go to his website, you'll see and his son, Jay, also, and he and I communicate some too, but he does not believe his dad's theology either.
Yeah.
And they kind of butt heads on some things. But that prosperity gospel, Taylor, there is truth in it. It's just that when you use it for your own gain, that's not godly. But if we are cheerful givers and if we are generous givers, the Bible does say God will take care of you. And I believe that. I believe that if we give generously, that God does bless us. And I'm not sure what that means all the time, because I do think that there are financial blessings that come from being generous to ministries. But I also think there's spiritual blessings that come from that too. And when you just talk about the money part, it can be very manipulative. And you can manipulate people easily with it because money speaks loudly to people in their lives. Yeah. And so you have to just be careful with it. So your question was, where did that prosperity gospel kind of come from? And it was mainly, it's been going on since probably the 50s when TV became a tool that ministry started to use. But it really in the 80s hit hard. And all these televangelists popped up all over the place. I don't know the guy's name. You guys may have heard, I've been seeing some clips of the podcast, but there's an influencer who has a podcast. This kid, he's probably 24, 25 years old. He sat down and had a interview with Kenneth Copeland.
Oh, yeah.
And then there's another guy that did it with Joel Osteen recently, too.
Oh, I haven't seen that.
And I've listened to both of them, and it's very interesting. You know, Kenneth Copeland is a little stronger on it, but he does get caught on the carpet by this kid, which is really interesting. But Joel Osteen says, yeah, I totally believe that you get financial blessings if you give. It comes back to you. But I don't benefit from those gifts that come to my church because I don't take a salary from my church. And so for the past 10 years, he's not taken a salary from Lakewood Church, and he lives off money he makes on his books. And so he doesn't take any salary anymore for the past 10 years. They don't pay him a salary. He's just made a lot of money on his books. I mean, he said when in this interview, his second book sold almost 2 million copies. So he's making money that way. But he does still preach a prosperity gospel, and he really believes it.
Well, and, you know, as Methodist, John Wesley's got that famous save all you can, earn all you can, save all you can, give all you can.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily about have it. So it's, I guess, to wind this down, it's not about how much you have. It's really how you're how you're handling it.
I think that's exactly
Wesley's
right.
saying, hey, earn all you can. Absolutely. Save it, right? But don't hoard it.
Yes.
Because giving is the last and probably most important part of that. So, and Jesus' teaching, it's very much on a sacrificial type of giving,
Right.
give to a level that makes you a little uncomfortable, because that's where spiritual growth comes from. And that's what you're saying. The prosperity that can come from that is a spiritual blessing.
Yeah. And the question you asked at the
growth.
beginning today, is it okay to be rich and be Christian? I think it absolutely is.
Yeah.
It absolutely is okay to be rich and Christian. It's what you do with the money.
Yeah.
It's not that you have the money, it's what you do with the money. And I believe that it can be a real indicator to what God will do for us in his goodness too. There's not anything wrong with that. Now you can get in all the conversations about, one of the biggest things that impacted me in my whole life, actually caused me to move toward a transition in my whole ministry, was my going to India. And so you can get into this whole conversation. I was over in India at the worst slums in the world, in New Delhi. And I saw the worst poverty that I've ever seen in my whole life. And so you can have the conversation about, well, gosh, what about those people? And is it okay to be rich while those people are suffering like they're suffering over there? And again, I say yes. It's what you do with it, because I know a lot of rich people who help kids in New Delhi. So that's the way I look at it.
Yeah.
You're never going to solve the problem of poverty. Here's what we've got to at least get into this podcast. Jesus said the poor will always be with you. So we're never going to eliminate poverty. We can help and do all we can to eliminate it, but we're never going to eliminate it. Jesus said they'll always be with you. I think he meant the spiritually poor, but I also think he meant the materially poor.
Yeah. Well, that's a good place to wind this one down. So next week, we'll continue the conversation on some hard questions. So we want to make sure you tune into that. But we also hope this conversation's been meaningful to you, and we hope that you'll share it with others so that it can be meaningful to them. And as always, you can find us on YouTube, Apple Music, Spotify, and on our website at graceresurrection.org. We'd love for you to join us each week for our next episodes of the Grace and Truth podcast. And until next time, may the good Lord bless and keep you.
Till we meet again.